Welcome to part 2 of today's Interfaith Lecture Series, in this week in which we are focusing on the theme, Crisis of Faith, ? We have already been gifted with brilliant insights and instructive information today, and you are about to be similarly gifted again. I'm Maureen Raveno, and I serve as Associate Director for the Department of Religion, and it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome our next distinguished speaker. Alan Cooperman is Director of Religion Research at the nonpartisan Pew Research Center, where he oversees a staff of more than 20 researchers who conduct surveys, demographic analyses, and other empirical studies around the world. He is an expert on religion's role in American politics and foreign policy, and he has supervised the center's landmark studies on the rise of the nones, which we all know is spelled N-O-N-E-S, and other changes in the U.S. religious landscape, as well as many international surveys of religion in all its manifestations. Before joining the center in 2009, he was a national reporter and editor at the Washington Post. He was foreign editor of U.S. News and World Report and a foreign correspondent in Moscow and Jerusalem for U.S. News and World Report and the Associated Press. Alan Cooperman is the author of Mormons in America, Muslim Americans, the U.S. Religious Knowledge Survey, Nuns on the Rise, and a portrait of Jewish Americans. And he was also the primary editor of Global Christianity and Global Restrictions on Religion. Alan has appeared on all the major news media outlets and is in demand all over the country for the wisdom and the information that he brings. Alan was here in 2014, and we knew then that we would need to have him back, especially in this week, in which he would give us yet another angle of vision on the state of religion in our country and indeed the world. We are so very pleased that he is with us today. So please join me in welcoming back to Chautauqua, with great appreciation, Alan Cooperman.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you to Robert Franklin for inviting me back. I'm delighted to be back at Chautauqua. Soon, Robert Franklin, as you know, is leaving, but you're in very, very good hands with Gene Robinson and Maureen Raveno. I am pleased to be here again. I have to tell you, the Chautauqua audience, as you know, is a fabulous audience. You are inquisitive, you are curious, and you have tremendous bladder control. So thank you for staying. I flew up yesterday from Washington. It's a short flight, and I had a book that I really wanted to read, and it's good. It's Graham Allison's new book, and I was really into it. So I was kind of disappointed when the guy next to me gave me the dreaded "What do you do?" question. But I have the answer. I knew exactly what to say. I said, I do quantitative social science of religion. Because that is the immediate conversation stopper, right there. I've never had anybody ask a second question after that. But this guy must have been a Chautauquan, because he was not daunted. And he said, quantitative study of religion. That must be really hard. And then I was stuck. As a former journalist, I am very rarely at a loss for words. But I didn't know what to say. Do I say, no, actually, it's really easy. Even a former journalist can do it. It's easier than spelling Chautauqua. Or do I say, oh, no, you're right, it's really hard. I wish I could get a job in a coal mine. So what I ended up telling him a little bit about my office. So I work at the Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C., and our offices are very modern. There's a lot of glass. And the glass isn't just on the outside, the glass is on the inside. All the offices have glass walls. I think this is supposed to be a metaphor for transparency. But what it actually results in is a lot of lumps on people's foreheads. I'm not kidding about that. A lot of people banging into glass walls. Until one day, somebody had the bright idea and showed up at work with several boxes of magic markers. And we were all told, go ahead, write on the walls. So now everybody writes on the walls. And those who have any artistic talent do drawings. There are amazing drawings. There are also some bar graphs and that kind of stuff, but amazing drawings. I don't have any artistic talent. So on my walls, on my glass wall, my office, I have two aphorisms that I kind of live by. The first one comes from the great Dutch chemist, Heike Onis. You all know Dutch. He said, door meten tot weten. It was what was inscribed on the door above his laboratory. Through measurement comes knowledge. I find this, for me, really helpful because it keeps reminding me that accurate and repeated measurement is the foundational method of all science, including what we're attempting to do, which is the social science of religion. The other aphorism that I have written on my glass wall comes from an American sociologist, W. Bruce Cameron. And it goes like this. Maybe you've heard it. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So I try to bear that in mind. I hope you all will bear that in mind today. During my talk, feel free to challenge me on it. I thought I would begin with a question. Pretty simple question. Are Americans as a whole becoming less religious? Now, you all just heard a talk, so you probably think you know the answer to that. So it's a seemingly simple question. Let's put it to a vote. All those who think that Americans as a whole are becoming less religious, please say, and shout it out, don't be shy, please say aye. All those who think Americans as a whole are not becoming less religious, please say and shout it out, nay. Nay. Ooh. Well, maybe the Russian influence, but I think the ayes have it. In fact, this is a question that sociologists of religion have been wrestling over for some time. And it is not a simple question, and one reason that I asked you to vote on it is that the simple act of voting, as people know when they go into the voting booth, tends to concentrate the mind. And some of you, perhaps many of you, even may have wondered for a moment, how do I answer that? What does it mean to be religious? Actually, that's not such a simple question, and that's where I wanted you to go. Because again, sociologists of religion are also not entirely simple people, even though we do collect data, and we recognize it's not a simple question. And if I were asked that question, I really struggle with it. My answer would have to be yes and no. And let me try to explain why and give you some of the coin. Back in 2007, the Pew Research Center conducted the first of our gigantic nationwide religious landscape surveys. These are massive surveys, 35,000 interviews of people dialed at random on cell phones and landlines all across the United States. Very high quality, very expensive, very complicated surveys. But they allow us with a sample size, that's 30 times or more the size of a typical national political poll. This allows us to look at religious groups that are as small as 0.3% of the US population, or groups about the size of Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, this is a very powerful poll. We repeated it in 2014, asking identical set. We asked some new questions, but mainly identical set of questions, asked identical context, same methodology, same sample size, all around there. So two massive twin surveys, 7 years apart. And what do we see? We do see that some of the conventional measures of religious belief and behavior in the US public as a whole have gone down. And they've gone down a little bit. But remember, this is a period of just 7 years. So I'll give you some examples. The share of all American adults who say they pray daily has dropped from 58% in 2007 to 55% in 2014. The share who say that religion is very important in their lives has dropped from 56% to 53%. The share who say they attend religious services at least monthly has dropped from 54% to 50%. The share who believe Scripture is the Word of God has dropped from 63% to 60%. The share who believe in God has dropped from 92% to 89%. Now, two things you'll note. First of all, these numbers are not low. These are very high numbers compared to many other countries in the world. Secondly, the declines are relatively small. Given the size of the sample and the margins of error, however, these are statistically significant at a 95% confidence level, declines. Now, at the same time, and I think you heard in the last discussion, some talk about the rise of the nones, people who don't identify with any religious group. But you recognize, I hope, that the vast majority of Americans still do identify with some religious group. In fact, 71% of American adults call themselves Christians of one flavor or another. About another 6% belong to various kinds of non-Christian faiths. So altogether, 3/4 of American adults do identify with a religion. Now, the reason that I have to say to that first question, yes and no, is because when we look at religious beliefs and practices among the Americans who do still identify with a religion, they have not significantly changed. The share of religiously affiliated Americans who say they pray daily was 65% in 2007 and 66% in 2014. The share who say religion is very important to them was 64% in 2007, and it's 66% in 2014. The share who say they attend religious services at least monthly, 63% in 2007, 62% in 2014, and so on. I can go on. The share who say they believe in God, 97% in 2007, 97% in 2014. Listen carefully. All of the overall decline in religiosity in the American public is entirely attributable to the rising share of American adults who do not identify with any religion. Do I need to say that again? All of the decline is because of the rising number and percentage share of Americans who are religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, who when you ask them, what is your religion, if any, say atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Among Americans who identify with a religion, any religion, they may just say, I'm a Christian. They may say, I'm a Baptist. They may say, I'm a Southern Baptist. They may say, I'm a Presbyterian. They may say, I'm a member of the Presbyterian Church USA. No matter how specific or non-specific they are, they may be non-denominational. Among those who identify with a religion, including those who say there's flying spaghetti monsters, the whole kit and caboodle of those who identify with a religion, if you look at that group writ large, the religious beliefs and behaviors of that group have not discernibly declined. Yet there is an overall decline. That overall decline is because of the rise of the nones. Okay? That's why I'm going to focus today specifically and especially on the nones. I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about who they are, about why they may be rising, and I'm going to talk very carefully, gingerly a little bit, about what difference it makes, why it might matter, why it might be not entirely a good thing, even from the point of view of nones, and also in answer to one of the questions that was asked at the end that really didn't get much of an answer, what are some religious leaders trying to do about it? Now, Just before I launch into all this, a quick word about myself. So it's not a secret, I'm Jewish. I'm not the most observant Jew, I'm not Orthodox, but I do go to synagogue. I belong to a synagogue. I go pretty regularly. We light candles in my household on Friday nights and so on. For the purposes of this lecture, however, I'm not Jewish. For the purposes of this lecture, I'm Pewish. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, he doesn't look Pewish. Okay, the Pew Research Center, where I work, is a no-holds-barred, nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy research center. We're entirely foundation-supported, mostly by the Pew Charitable Trusts. So we have no clients. We have no advertisers. We don't sell anything to anybody. It's not our mission to support progressive religion or the religious left, or to promote it, or to find good things about it. It's not our mission to support or promote the religious right. I will do my level best to deliver to you the news, be it good news or bad news, in your view, and that's up to you to decide, and I will try to be impartial. And if I'm not, if I seem to be taking normative positions on things, pro-Democrat or pro-Republic, anything like that, call me out on it. I apologize in advance, because that is not my MO, and that's not the MO of the Pew Research Center. When we say we're nonpartisan, we really mean it. We really try to walk that walk. And the reason is not just because we're trying to get everybody to accept our data, though I do hope the fact that we don't have a dog in the fight does help people to accept our data. But really it's because if you have a dog in the fight, consciously or not, it can affect your research. Okay? If you really want one side to come out ahead, it can affect your research, whether you know it or not. So we really tried hard. Now, while I'm Jewish, this lecture is Pewish. The phenomenon that I'm going to focus on is newish. So the nuns, the rise of the nuns, it's not an entirely new thing. It's also, though, not that old. So as recently as about 1970s into the early 1980s, the share of the American public, when asked in opinion surveys, what is your present religion, if any, the share who said nothing, nada, don't have one, none of the above, none, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, was negligible. It was 5% or less. 95 out of 100 Americans, whether they belonged to a congregation or not, they named a religion. And that was true for a long time. But it began to change in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And it took, interestingly, about 20 years. You can see this in the General Social Survey, which is a long-running social survey, very high-quality survey. You can see that it took about 20 years, from about 1972 to about 1992, to go from 5% of the population to 10% of the population. Then it took about 10 years to go from 10% of the population to 15% of the population. Then it took about 5 years to go from 15% of the population to 20% of the population. Now it's 23% of the overall population. It's about 36% of adults in the millennial generation, that is, adults born after 1980. And this is not just found in Pew Research Center surveys. Now, how one asks the religion question, exactly how you phrase it, and exactly what options you give people will change slightly how they answer the question. And so different surveys find slightly different numbers, but every survey that asks this question consistently finds the same trend. In the General Social Survey, in the American Religious Identification surveys, in Gallup surveys, in Washington Post ABC surveys, in Pew Research Center surveys, we all find the share of the public who does not identify with any religion has been rising, and rising pretty quickly. Now again, let me be sure you all understand the definition. When I say a nun, N-O-N-E, I mean someone who says atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. If they say they're any kind of Christian or identify with any group, whether it exists or not, or exists only in their own mind or not, then from my point of view as a sociologist, they are religiously affiliated. So non-denominational Christians, make no mistake, they are not nuns in the data I'm giving you, okay? The nuns, again, are people who do not identify with any religious group at any level, okay? Now, while the share of the nuns has been rising, the share of Christians has been falling. And in those two twin surveys that I told you about, 2007 to 2014, in 2007, a little more than 78% of American adults identified as some flavor of Christian. By 2014, it was 71%. So it dropped 7 points in 7 years. Okay. Now, you also see if you subdivide Christians into smaller groups. And by the way, to me, white Christians is way too big a group to be of any relevance, either politically or religiously. It's an incredibly diverse group. Yes, in our data as well, white Christians are now less than 50% of the public, but it's not a group I don't usually analyze people that way. But if we look at some other groups that may be more familiar to you, for example, those who identify as Catholic, the share of the population that identifies as Catholic has begun to drop a little bit. For many years, it had held steady at between 20 and 25% of the population. It's been dropping. Now in our data, it's about 21%. White mainline Protestants have been dropping as a share of the population. I'm sure that's not news to you. Contrary to what you might have heard, white evangelical Protestants are dropping as a share of the population. Not as fast as white mainline, but nonetheless, they also dropped in our survey. Historically, black Protestants, however, are pretty stable. Mormons and Jews also pretty stable, and those groups are relatively small at 2% of the population or less. Now, just to, numbers, percentages are sometimes hard for people to get their heads around, so let's talk absolute numbers. In 2007, there were about 227 million adults in the United States. The population is growing. So by 2014, there were about 245 million, i.e. growth of 18 million more adults. Yet over that time, the absolute number of Christians in our data dropped. So the absolute number of Christians dropped by something in the neighborhood probably of about 5 to 6 million. Still the lion's share of the public, but not only did Christians drop in percentage terms, but they dropped in absolute numbers over just that 7-year period, from about 178 million to about 172 or 173 million. Now, think about the nuns. The nuns are increasing not only in share, but in numbers as well. And they went from about 37 million in 2007 to 56 million in 2014, so an increase of 19 million. The nuns today, if you were to think of them as a religious group, and you were to use the categories that sociologists of religion typically use, they would be the second largest religious group in the United States, exceeded only by people who belong to denominations in the evangelical tradition. They are larger than mainline Protestants in absolute number and larger than Roman Catholics in absolute number. Again, we're talking about a group in the neighborhood of 56 million people. Now, there are a lot of myths about the nuns, so I'm going to try, by way of talking about who are the nuns, I'm going to talk about some common myths, and I hope knock some of them down. The first common myth is that the rise of the nuns is just a coastal thing among elites, and/or that it's just among college-educated people who've been brainwashed by their atheist professors. I can positively disprove this, and it's very simple. We can look at the numbers, and we see that the share of nuns actually is rising in all regions of the country, albeit from different starting points and to different levels, but it's risen, the number of nuns, percentage of nuns has risen significantly all across the country, including in the Bible Belt. The nuns have risen among all major racial and ethnic groups. They've risen among college graduates and among people with a high school education or less. And they've risen among men and women. Another myth about the nuns is that, maybe because some people like Alan Cooperman call them nuns, must be that they must all be atheists. They must have no religion. After all, they didn't identify with a religion. Well, of course, that's wrong. Just as there's a spectrum of religious belief and practice within every religious group, within all the religious groups that you all belong to, and you're aware of that, there are highly observant Catholics and less observant Catholics, and highly observant Methodists and less observant Methodists, and a range of political, right, and racial and other views within all these groups. There also are significant variances within the nuns. People are not consistent, okay? Overall, of that group of now about 23% of the population of adults, about 3% flatly identify as atheist, about 4% identify as agnostic, and about 16% identify as nothing in particular. So that nothing in particular group is the largest group. Now, I love this fact, by the way. I noted that the people are not consistent. There's some variance in every group. I think it may interest you to know that of the approximately 3% of American adults who identify as atheists, there is a small group, something in the neighborhood of 5%, who tell us that they believe in God or a universal spirit with absolute certainty. None of you are shaking your heads or what? As a colleague of mine says, look, either they don't know what the word atheist means, or they have a very complicated theology. My only point is, again, there's actually, there's a spectrum within every group, even within atheists, okay? Now, of the nuns as a whole, a majority of nuns tell us they believe in God, 61%. 37% believe in heaven. 27% believe in hell. 20% pray daily. One thing that the nuns really do not do, it won't surprise those of you who are ministers, pastors, priests, nuns of the other variety, they don't go to church. 9% say they attend religious services once a month or more. Now, while that should, I think, give the lie to the notion that nuns have absolutely no religious beliefs or practices, it's also not true that they are somehow just as religious as other Americans. In fact, they're not. The share who believe in God is much lower than the share of affiliated Americans who believe in God. The share who pray daily is lower. The share who attend religious services is much lower, and so on. On all the standard measures of religiosity, they're much lower. The other thing about the nuns that's really quite interesting is that over time, if anything, they're becoming more secular. If we look at the nuns in our 2007 survey, in our 2014 survey, the share of the nuns who believe in God has gone down. The share of the nuns who attend religious services has gone down, and so on. So they are growing. They are less religious, markedly less religious by all classical measures than the affiliated public, and over time they are becoming less religious. Now, another myth is, and you all have heard this a lot, they're not religious, but they're spiritual. Well, to some extent, perhaps, okay, this isn't entirely wrong. But I will tell you that the highest levels of spirituality, as best we can measure it, are found among Americans, I don't think this actually should surprise you, who are conventionally religious, not among the nuns. Okay? So overall, when we ask, do you think of yourself as a religious person or not? And we ask, do you think of yourself as a spiritual person or not? We can get 4 categories: those who are both, those who are neither, and those who are one but not the other, right? And among affiliated Americans, those who say they have a religion, the vast majority consider themselves both religious and spiritual. The lion's share of the nuns, the plurality, not a majority, but the plurality of them, consider themselves neither religious nor spiritual. There is a group, about 35% of the unaffiliated, who consider themselves spiritual but not religious. But again, that's actually smaller than the share who consider themselves neither spiritual nor religious. And when we try to measure spiritual beliefs and practices, things like astrology and belief in reincarnation, belief in engaging in yoga, not just as exercise, but as a spiritual practice, or even a question that I helped write some years ago that I'm very partial to. Do you believe in spiritual energy, in physical things like mountains, trees, and crystals? On these sorts of measures, the unaffiliated, yes, many of them do believe these things, but not in significantly higher numbers than affiliated Americans. So Americans as a whole tend to believe many of these things. I hope you may realize 25% of American adults tell us they believe in astrology. And that's 25% of those who are religiously affiliated, as well as 25% of those who are not affiliated. 24% of affiliated Americans tell us they believe in reincarnation. 25% of unaffiliated Americans believe in reincarnation. So it's not, the point is, both groups are spiritual in various ways, or have various, you might want to think of them as New Age or heretical, non-orthodox, heterodox beliefs, whatever. But the nuns do not exceed religious people on those measures. My fourth myth about the nuns, and I'm sure you've heard this too, goes kind of like this. Well, these nuns, actually, these are people who never really went to church. They just called themselves Methodists or Catholics or Presbyterians, and now they don't anymore. Now, there is some truth to this. This one is really interesting. This is not entirely a myth. Because what we can see is that if we take all the people, U.S. adults, who have relatively low levels of religious belief and practice, and we look, first we're looking at that, low belief and practice, and we say, okay, how do they identify themselves? The share of those people who identify as nuns has been rising. So there is a kind of social desirability thing going on where people who were already low in belief and practice are maybe more willing today to just say, I don't have any religion. And maybe because the social desirability of having a religion is not as great as it used to be. And maybe even, in fact, the social undesirability of having a religion within certain circles is greater than it used to be. In any event, that has changed. But here's the other thing to realize. It's not just that, because the share of all Americans who are low in religious beliefs and practices also has been rising. Both things have been taking place. And the nuns are growing as a consequence of both of those things. Because a lot of this is generational. And I'll get to that in a minute. The fifth and final myth, maybe the most trenchant myth. I hear this a lot from ministers. It goes like this. They're young. They'll come back. They'll have kids. They'll get married. Maybe not in that order. When they grow up, they'll come back to church, temple, mosque. Well, there's people's intuition about this is kind of right. Okay? The data do show that as people age, they tend, as Americans have aged, they tend to become more religious in some ways. We can track by generation in various surveys, not just Pew surveys, but for example, again, the general social surveys. We can track a whole generation. And take my generation, the boomer generation. As we've gotten older, reached middle age, even for some of us surpassed middle age, not me, I'm a late boomer, we've begun to pray more, to go to church, temple, mosque more often, and to say religion is more important in our lives. So in some ways, maybe it's mortality, maybe it's life cycle changes, we do tend to become more religious. But, and this is really interesting, I wish I could show you this on a graph. I have the graph in front of me. I'm not working from a text, I'm working from charts and tables. If we plot recent generations on a chart in which we, over time, monitor the share who are unaffiliated, we see something really interesting. Each recent generation has started out less affiliated than the prior generation, and no recent generation has become more affiliated over time. So let me just give you some numbers so that that can soak in. If you look at the greatest generation, my parents' generation, the World War II generation, back in the early 1970s, and they were already fully formed adults, many in middle age by that, or early middle age by that era, 3% of the greatest generation in the 1970s were unaffiliated, just 3%. Today, 7% of those remaining members of the greatest generation are religiously unaffiliated. You look at the silent generation, the immediate post-World War II generation. Probably many of you in this room are silent. 6% in the early 1970s were unaffiliated. Today, 10% are unaffiliated. Take a look at the boomer generation. In the late 1970s, when the boomers first came of age, became adults, 13% were unaffiliated. Today, 15% are unaffiliated. Millennials, Generation X started at 20, now 21. Millennials started at 26, now 29. You get the point. We do tend to get more religious in certain ways as we've grown older, but no recent generation of Americans has become more involved, more entangled with organized religion as it has aged. Now, I can't predict the future, but that's been the pattern. So, what's behind the growth of nuns? What's going on here? Well, there are two sort of proximate causes, and I can nail the proximate causes. Generational replacement. Generational replacement is just a nice way of saying people die. Older generations pass away, young generations come in. And as I've just described to you, each recent generation of young people has been less affiliated than the prior generation. The other thing is religious switching. People who were raised in a religion, people who held that religion, and then at some point in their lives, often when they're young, but not always, they've left that religion. Of course, there's movement in both directions, but on the whole, much more movement from, in terms of absolute numbers, from having a religion to having no religion, than vice versa. To me, both of those things are interesting, but they kind of just beg the question. So those are proximate, those are mechanisms, if you will, generational replacement and religious switching, but they don't really answer the question, why? So what the heck is going on here? Well, I've read the literature on this, tried to digest it, and to simplify somewhat, I'm going to try to give you four main theories. And these are not my theories. These are theories in the sociological literature, and they're not mutually exclusive. Well, to some degree, all of them or multiple of them may be true. And the mnemonic that I use to remember these theories goes like this: politics, marriage, bowling, and affluence. So let's start with politics. In the trade, this is known as the Haut-Fischer hypothesis, after two wonderful sociologists, Mike Haut and Claude Fischer. And what they noted, first of all, was a kind of coincidence of timing. When did the nuns begin to rise? In the 1980s and early 1990s, around the same time as what used to be called, sometimes is still called, the Christian right, or the moral majority. What else did they note? Well, they noted that religiously unaffiliated adults tend to be politically liberal, tend to lean democratic much more than the general public, tend to be liberal on issues like same-sex marriage or attitudes toward homosexuality in general, also tend to be more liberal in questions about just generally the role of government, preferring a larger government to a smaller government, for example. They also noted that in our surveys and other surveys, religiously unaffiliated adults do tend to say some very nice things about organized religion. Most do tend to say that organized religions help bring people together, that they help the poor, for example. But they also say some negative things to a much greater degree than affiliated Americans. And one of those is, by pretty substantial numbers, 2/3 of the unaffiliated say that organized religious groups are too involved with politics. So in short, the Haut-Fischer hypothesis is that the rise of the nuns is driven, they think largely, you might think partly or to some extent, by politics, that it is a political backlash. And it is a backlash against what is perceived to be an over-entanglement of organized religion and politics, and particularly conservative politics. And the way Howard and Fisher have described it, and again, these are their words, not mine, they say young people in particular are saying, when they look at organized religion, they see judgmental, political, lowercase c conservative, hidebound in sexual terms groups, and they say that's what religion is. I don't want to have anything to do with it. So that's one hypothesis. Now, Robert Wuthnow at Princeton has complicated, I think, the picture in a very interesting way. He's pointed to trends in marriage. And the trends in marriage in the United States are just fascinating, because the share of the US adult public that is currently married used to be close to 3/4. Back in 1960, it was 72%. This is US Census data. Today, it has dropped below 50%. So if you want to talk about white Christian America dropping below 50%, bear in mind some other things. Protestants are now, probably for the first time in US history, below 50%. Married people are probably for the first time in US history below 50%. Whites, according to the Census Bureau, are projected to be soon less than 50%. There's a lot of different demographic change going on here. But what's interesting about marriage is that it's not just divorce. I mean, divorce has ticked up. Divorce is higher now than it used to be. But that's not the big thing. What's really amazing is the share who are never married. You have any idea what share of US adults today are never married? It's now 30%. It's double what it used to be in 1960. So part of this is people not getting married, delaying marriage taking place later and later, but also never getting married. So not going through those life cycle changes, not raising the kids, right? And Wuthnow suggests maybe that has something to do with the rise of the nuns. Religious intermarriage, by the way, also rising. Now, bowling, that's of course the most interesting. And I take this from Robert Putnam's wonderful book, Bowling Alone. And essentially here, Putnam has flipped the lens on us. And he said, hey, folks, maybe this isn't about religion. Maybe religion is not a cause here. Maybe what's happening in American religion is an effect of broader changes in the society. And what's happening here is that the society as a whole is becoming atomized. We are just not as connected, because it's not just religious institutions that are declining. When was the last time you saw a big crowd at the Elks Club? Fraternal organizations, virtually all bricks and mortar organizations where people come together for common purposes are declining, with the maybe one exception of health clubs, if you can consider that to be gyms. Consider that to be a bricks and mortar institution where people come together for common, albeit narcissistic purposes. Oops, I'm a nonpartisan pollster. Let me take that back. I've even been known to darken the door of a gym once in a while myself. The last of these theories is the theory that I will just call affluence. It's really secularization theory. And this one takes it even a step further. It says, hey, well, this isn't just about US society. This is about the whole world. This is about a common pattern in which, as societies become richer, they become less religious. And this is something, kind of exhibit A for this, is one of the most popular scatter plot charts the Pew Research Center has ever produced. It went wild on the web when we produced it. And what we did in this chart is, on one axis, we plotted GDP per capita in countries, and on the other axis, a kind of index of religiosity, made up of a variety of measures of how religious people are. And you see a very clear curve and a very clear correlation. Richer countries tend to be richer countries tend to be less religious. Poorer countries tend to be more religious. But there are two great outliers, and you know one of them, the United States. And we're an outlier because we're relatively rich and we're quite religious. But what's the other big outlier? China. China's relatively poor and relatively non-religious. In fact, globally, and I can talk a little bit at the end, or maybe we'll get to it in questions, globally, the largest share of the nuns in the world are in China. And again, this is there's a political overhang here, very importantly in China. So the kind of the latest version of that secularization theory, and let me again emphasize, I'm not promoting any of these theories. I'm just trying to tell you what's out there in the literature. I'm not stumping for secularization theory. But the latest version of secularization theory, which you should know about, it's really kind of interesting, is that it's not just rich and poor. That what really matters is the degree of existential insecurity in a country. And existential insecurity can come from being poor, but it can also come from things like having a lot of guns, not having a well-formed or relatively well-formed social safety net, from having a lot of social change, things that may be more endemic in democracies or whatever. And when you have that combination of things, even if people are relatively rich, they feel existential insecurity, and when they feel existential insecurity, they are called to believe or to practice or to be more religious. That's a theory, anyway. Let me now turn to, does it matter? And let me just say, again, I personally do not have a dog in this fight. I'm not here to tell you on behalf of the Pew Research Center that the growth of the nuns is something to worry about. Obviously, there are people who applaud it, and people who see it as progress in human lights to move away from religion. And it's not my role as a researcher on religion to promote any particular religion or religion over non-religion. But I have set myself a bit of a higher bar and tried to say why this might matter. Because if you do hold religious beliefs, especially sectarian beliefs, as the bulk of Americans do, then why it matters is pretty obvious, right? It can be a matter of souls, it can be a matter of really just religious principle. But I've tried to set a higher bar, and what I try to do is to set, okay, could I tell a nun, or could I persuade a nun, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, that'd be easy, but could I persuade an N-O-N-E nun that the growth of the N-O-N-E nuns is something possibly to worry about? And I think I can, just from the data. Again, with no other normative involvement. And I'll take you back here to, I'm sure most of you have read this wonderful book, uses a lot of our polling, but also other polling, American Grace, by David Campbell and Robert Putnam. If you haven't read it, you should. It has a wonderful chapter in the middle of it. It's called something like, and this is probably not the exact chapter title, but Why Religious People Make Good Neighbors. And the argument that it makes is that religious people, in fact, aren't just good neighbors, they're actually better neighbors. And it's not just because if you're sick, they'll bring you soup or they'll invite you to their church. It's because they're more likely to coach your kid's Little League team. They're more likely to be involved in the local school board. People who are active in religious organizations are more active in every kind of civic organization. And they are especially more likely, and you can see this in all kinds of data, our data and others, they are more likely to donate money and more likely to volunteer their time. And make no mistake, they're not only more likely to donate money and volunteer their time to religious organizations, they're also more likely to donate money and volunteer their time to secular organizations. Now, you might think this is because of the religious impulse, what they're taught, and it may be. But you could also, again, try not to have a dog in the fight. You could also say, wait, that may not be what's going on at all. It may not be that religion and the religious impulse or teachings is making people better neighbors, better citizens, more civically active. It could just be, it's a characterological disposition. People who are social, who want to be social, who want to be involved with others, guess what? What's the main way to do that in America? Be part of a church. But there are other ways to do it too. And so the people who do one are more likely to do the other. You can put it very simply. Joiners are joiners. Here's the thing. Are nuns non-joiners? And if they're non-joiners, that means they're not only less likely to be active in religious things, they're also less likely to donate and give. And in fact, that is what we find. We also find that they are less, that younger people are less likely to donate and to give than older people. And insofar as we can tell, and these figures are a little bit difficult, I also think there's a case to be made, probably not an ironclad case, but a case to be made that they are also less civically engaged, less likely to donate, less likely to give than younger people were in the past. Now, let me be clear on this too, just to set the record straight. I'm not trying to make the case that religious people are across the board better people, because that's not true in every way. For example, in our data, and we've asked about this, religious people are just as likely to overeat as non-religious people. They are just as likely, but no more likely to recycle. They are just as likely, but no more likely to say they consider employees' wages or a company's environmental record when they make purchasing decisions. And they're no more likely to exercise on a regular basis than non-religious people. So it's not necessarily that being religious makes you a better person or that better people become religious, but there's a very strong correlation, again, between religious activity and other kinds of activity. Religiously active people are, on average, considerably more involved in charitable and volunteer organizations, in community groups and neighborhood associations, in political parties, in alumni associations, in parent organizations, in amateur theatricals, musicals, or artistic groups, in book clubs, in youth groups, in veterans organizations. In short, the two things are tied together. And you know this because you all have good bladder control and you are, many of you, people of some years, you know that religious groups have tended to inculcate in younger Americans the habits of giving and donating. The nuns have, at the moment, no such organizations of any note and no such pattern. And you can see that not only today are younger adults less active in church groups and spiritual groups, by the way, best about both, but they are also much less likely than older Americans to say they volunteered in the past week or to say that they've donated money or time or goods to the poor. Now, there's one other reason that I think that this trend in the United States, the rise of the nuns, may matter, and that I could even argue to a nun, N-O-N-E, that it matters. And that is because the worldwide trend is in the opposite direction. Yes. Contrary to Karl Marx, take it there. The world is not, as a whole, moving away from religion. We've done lots of studies on this, published big book-length studies, and it's really a fascinating thing. And the key here is we live in a very religiously vibrant marketplace. Americans are constantly switching their religions, right? In fact, depending on how you define having changed a religion, half of Americans have a different religion than the one in which they were raised, or have switched and switched back, okay? But that's not true in many places and around the world. And religious change around the world is primarily a product of natural population growth, of fertility and mortality and the age distribution of populations. The fastest growing group in the world is Muslims, religious group. That's not because people are converting to Islam. It's because Muslims tend to live in places in the world where their populations are very young, they have very high birth rates, and longevity, mortality rates are dropping rapidly. So that's why Muslims are growing. The nuns, N-O-N-E-S, where are the nuns concentrated? Western Europe, which is in demographic decline. Western Europe is not replacing itself by natural population growth. Western Europe is shrinking in absolute numbers. Where else? China. One-child policy. Chinese government is very concerned about it. China has negative population growth or close to it. It has an aging population. Japan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, these are places where the nuns are concentrated, and they're places with aging populations and low fertility rates. The parts of the world that are growing fastest, like sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, parts of Latin America, are places where almost everybody identifies with a religious group. As a result, in our projections, we've done projections, just demographic projections, the share of the world's population that does not identify with any religion will decline, if current trends continue, from about 16% in 2010 to about 13% in 2040 or 2050. So, we in the West, the nuns in the West, our societal trend away from organized religion is quite different from the trend in the rest. And it raises the question of a gulf, a kind of civilizational gulf. And I don't mean civilizational by Christianity versus Islam. Those are interesting questions too. But I'm just saying, can societies that are increasingly secular understand and deal with societies that are highly religious and growing more so? Or is that going to be a rising issue in terms of international understanding in the years ahead? Finally, and I know I've droned on for quite a while, but finally I did promise that I would say a little something about what some religious leaders are trying to do about the nuns. And again, not that I necessarily think that anything needs to be done about the nuns, and not that I'm trying to promote any of these things to you, but I follow this kind of thing, and so I'll mention one in particular. It's very interesting. You've probably seen it in your cities. Have you been to a Soul Cycle? So it's a kind of gym, a pedaling gym, bicycle gym, called Soul Cycle, and people go there to exercise. But very consciously, Soul Cycle also has people who minister, and they even kind of use sometimes that word, to people's souls. They're not affiliated with any religious group. They're definitely, they don't talk about God, but they do try to create a community of meaning at the gym. CrossFit has no sort of overtly religious thing going on, but it's a community of meaning where responsibility is a really big part of what being a CrossFit person is. And if you don't show up for your CrossFit session, other CrossFit folks will call and find out why you missed. They may even come visit you. They might even come bring you soup. Right? It's not just a gym, it's really a community. Have you heard of the Laundry Project? Nobody's heard of the Laundry Project? Well, this is really interesting. This is started in Tampa Bay, Florida, out of a church. But it's very clearly not associated with any denomination or even with a church. The Laundry Project people go into laundromats, and they find people there who are distressed, who don't have a place to do their laundry. And a lot of them have kids, and they try to give them a break. They do their laundry for them. They watch their kids for them. They minister to them where they find them in laundromats. And this is now in 13 cities across the United States. Another one's called Pop-Up Shabbat, started in New York City, but it's all over the country. Sounds Jewish, and it kind of is, but they take non-Jews as well at Pop-Up Shabbat. And they do Friday night Shabbat dinners. They light candles, and they talk. And they don't necessarily say prayers. They might not, depends on the group. Again, they're sort of welcoming all comers, highly oriented toward millennials, just again about trying to create a community of meaning, or in some way a sacred community, but not within any organizational bounds. And the last one I'll mention to you, is there anybody here by chance from the Florida Conference of the United Methodist Church? Nobody? Florida Conference? Okay. You know about the Nehemiah Project? Okay, so your bishop, Ken Carter, has done it's really kind of an amazing thing. It's an end-of-life plan for churches. And what they're actually trying to do is to accelerate the natural rate at which congregations close. Because what tends to happen to congregations, just as with individuals, is that a huge amount of resources and effort go into maintaining life in the very last stages. When you have a diminishing congregation and still an expensive building to maintain, and you've probably all seen congregations like this or certainly heard about them, and it is a pitiable condition. And people really spend it's often elderly folks, and the last years of their lives just using everything they can, both physically and spiritually, all their energy to try to keep that thing going. And what they're essentially saying in the Nehemiah Project is, let's not do that, folks. We're going to have a certain number of churches. Churches go through a life cycle. Congregations do, and we're going to have a certain number, it's maybe 5 or 6, that would close on an annual basis in the whole of the Florida Conference. Let's try to double that or triple that. And then let's take those resources and repurpose them. So they've got the Nehemiah Project, and then they've got something called Fresh Expressions. And Fresh Expressions is about, again, taking those energies and resources, material, spiritual, energy of people, and reaching out. And the way they put it in the, let's see if I've got it here. This is their words. Fresh Expressions catalyzes new expressions of church that reach new people in new places, in new ways. So they've done things like yoga chapel, they call it. They're overtly trying to reach the nuns and to minister to the nuns. And lastly, I'll mention that there's some folks at Harvard Divinity School where they have a new ministry innovation project, and they've got some young, very talented folks there who are trying to develop ministry to the nuns. And their notion is that organized religions are actually very well suited to do this, because the things that ministers do well are things that the nuns need. They just don't want it within an institutional context. And maybe a different language needs to be used, and maybe they need to be reached where they are, so to speak, in the gym, in the yoga chapel, so on, at the Soul Cycle. Again, I'm not trying to promote any of these, but I did want to throw some of them out there. I've probably exhausted you, and you want to go, but if there are any questions, I'd love to take them. Thank you.
Alan Cooperman, we are so grateful to you that you are Pewish, and we are fascinated by your research on the nuns. Very instructive, very enlightening. But I want to just assure everyone that Robert Franklin and Jean Robinson and I do not have any plans to change the name of our department from the Department of Religion to the Department of the Nuns. But there are folks here who would love to pose a question, and since we have a few minutes, we'll hope that there will be questions and not speeches disguised as questions. So make the questions precise, and we'll try to get in as many as we can.
Please, Kurt.
So if I listened well and understood you correctly, as we think about the generational trend for the past 50, 60 years, every generation has become less religious, and none of them are coming back. And that suggests that we collectively have become less effective or less caring about being evangelical or about evangelizing, both in terms of retention and attraction. And I wonder whether you have anything Pewish to say about that.
Thank you, Kurt. Did you all hear that, or do you want me to repeat the question? Okay, great. So first of all, I should correct you on just one little thing. I didn't mean to say that nobody comes back. People do come back to religion, but the overall movement in each generation has been away. So each generation not only has started more unaffiliated, but has become more unaffiliated over time, rather than less. Now, past does not predict the future. And one thing that I should say about the unaffiliated that's kind of interesting is that actually they have a terrible retention rate. It's very interesting. The share of people who are raised unaffiliated, who go on to take on a religion, is actually higher than the share of people who are raised with a religion who become unaffiliated. But the groups are gigantically different in size, at least to begin with. Again, 3/4 of Americans start out with a religion. So you have the attrition rate among those who were raised with a religion is about 80% to 20%. So 80% stay, 20% go. Among those who were raised with no religion, their attrition rate is about 46%. Almost half go on to take on a religion. Now, what's interesting is that at the moment, because of the different sizes of the groups, still in net terms, that's 3 to 1 people becoming non-religious for everyone becoming religious. But if those retention rates stay the same, if they don't change, ultimately those two things, the groups change in size, and ultimately it stabilizes. In fact, mathematically, it would stabilize at 70-30 with the current retention rates. In fact, of course, the retention rates are changing. What I mean would stabilize at 70% of the population affiliated, 30% unaffiliated. The current retention rates, 46% of those raised one going to the other, 20% of those raised with raised with a religion and it's a wash, and it's stable. My point is, you shouldn't necessarily assume that the current trends are just going to continue forever. I didn't mean to say that. But I do think that it's a bit of wishful thinking to assume that any current generation is going to return to church. But future generations may come of age in higher proportion religious than in the past.
Something or anything?
Well, you could try to do things. And the other thing I should mention, I mentioned all these things that church groups are trying to do, and I kind of mentioned ones that I thought are sort of out of the box. But there's the obvious thing, which is really what many evangelical denominations attempt to do, which is simply to hold on to their youth and evangelize. And evangelical denominations are quite successful. Evangelical denominations don't have especially great retention rates, but they have really great accession rates. They bring lots of people in. So they lose lots of people, but they bring lots of people in. And a group like Catholics in the United States is declining through religious switching, actually not because its retention rate is so terrible, but because its accession rate is so low. There's so few people coming in. Same with Jews. Jews actually have a very high retention rate, but they have a low accession rate.
Hello,
Okay,
I'm Nancy
please.
Young from Madison, Wisconsin, and thank you for your articulate teaching of us today. Your original question was how many of us think that the Americans are becoming more religious or less religious, but I was waiting for the definition of religious, and so I'm wondering if you have that on the tip of your tongue now.
Yeah. So, again, actually, the answer depends on how you define religious. And the two main types of answers that I gave are, one, religious identification, what people say. Do they identify with a religious group? And the other is what they say about their beliefs and practices, such things as, do they believe in God? Do they go to church? Do they believe in heaven? Do they believe in hell? What do they think about the Bible? How important is religion in their lives? These are the kinds of questions that we use to measure. Again, what I would say, not everything that counts can be counted. Mm-hmm. So there are other ways of possibly being religious, but I also mentioned giving, volunteering, mm-hmm. Doing for others. And on the whole, younger Americans are doing those things less. So they're not only less religious in terms of identification and less religious in terms of belief and practice, but also they are less giving of themselves in an altruistic way as a whole. I mean, I don't want to run down the entire generation, but that's the numbers.
Yep.
Yeah. On this side.
Hi, I missed the first part of your talk, sorry, so I may be asking something you covered. But I'm just curious, a lot of people that say they're not Christian or not religious commonly follow up with the statement, but I'm a good person. Why do you think they do that? And the second question is, do you think people that maybe go to the extreme of saying they're atheists truly believe that there is no God or don't believe in religion at all, or how strongly is that belief?
Yeah, so actually the share of Americans who say they don't believe in God is a bit higher than the share who self-identify as atheists. So they're not actually exactly the same thing. And people who self-identify as atheists, we know from our research, aren't necessarily antagonistic toward religion. Some are, but many are not. And we also know that, in fact, atheists have a wide variety of views about the supernatural, and not all self-defined atheists reject all elements of supernatural or spirituality. I'll just leave it at that and turn back over here.
I'm an atheist, and I reject all elements of supernatural. Oh, sorry, I'm an atheist. I reject all aspects of supernatural stuff. I'm also a minister in the United Church of Canada, and my congregation is made up predominantly of people who would be identified as nuns. I'm wondering if, when you talked about the rise of the nuns beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, I think it was the Hout Fisher political thing you were talking about at the time, and that was a reaction against the rise of evangelicals and their political power in the United States. I'm wondering also if that didn't coincide with the accessibility of the literature around progressive, critical contemporary scholarship within liberal theological colleges and seminaries becoming accessible to people in the pews. And so those boomers, 10% of boomers who have left the church, that's a very lot of people, who would have had access to that. And we've had John Spong and John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg here to speak, and that kind of material getting out there. So they and their children decide, why is the church still hanging on to all this language? Is there not an idolatry of language going on here? And so as a result, do you think that the mainline liberal denominations, who actually mitigated the social norms in communities, do you think they abdicated their responsibilities to those populations by holding on to that language instead of going with the scholarship that they were actually sharing in their theological seminaries?
So I have no doubt that for some contingent of the nuns, probably including many of the folks who would self-identify as atheists, that the kinds of things you're talking about are really important. So the impact of things like the Jesus Seminar and scholarship is probably very important to those folks. That is a small portion of all nuns. Many of the nuns, the bulk of the nuns, fall into that nothing in particular group. And many of them are not antithetical to religion, they're really just kind of indifferent to religion. Again, we know this from our surveys because they tend to say not negative things, not positive things. They're just kind of, eh. And a lot of them, I think, are simply not joiners. So I think that, again, the nuns is actually quite a large group, such a large group that there's a lot of variation within the group. But I'm sure you're right, that for some portion of intellectual nuns, the scholarship is very important. Now, there's also a kind of chicken and egg question, right? Whether a certain number of people who self-identify as atheists and are willing to come out and say that enables the scholarship or is part of that scholarship. What precedes what?
I also am waiting for that work that you're doing on the rise of the nuns and whether or not that's had a civic engagement issue.
Yeah, well, that's something that we're trying to look at around the world as well. We're trying to look at that in Europe. Europe's a great test case because in Europe, where secularization has gone farther than the United States, where very large shares of the public in many countries now in Western Europe don't identify with any religion. We're trying to see whether that also correlates with lower degrees of civic activity. It might just be an American thing because church is such a strongly, church is really has historically been the main civic activity for Americans. I mean, it's something de Tocqueville pointed out. I'm sorry, with apology, this will have to be the last question.
So if you're willing to work off of two premises, just for experimentation's sake. One, that the human soul, both individual and collective, abhors a vacuum in belief just as nature does. And two, that gods do not constitute worship. Worship, as it stands, constitutes the gods. Who are the gods, of the nuns? Because if it's the gym, that with what's the biggest surface in gyms? Mirrors. That should basically be enough to make everyone laugh and cry simultaneously.
Yeah.
So yeah. Who are the gods of the nuns? Yeah,
well, right? So this is my concern, and it's an excellent question about the nuns and what's going on. And again, I think that some part of the nuns are people who are disaffected politically from religion, but may have many of the same impulses to be engaged with other people in society at the same level that religious people are. Some of the nuns may actually be, if Putnam's theory about bowling alone is correct, and our society is atomizing, it may be and perhaps the internet and all its manifestations could be part of this, if you believe the kind of what Sullivan said this morning about it being a zero-sum game, involvement in virtual life and involvement in kind of real life, if it really is a zero-sum game. Some of the nuns may represent a growing degree of loss of social capital, as Putnam would put it, and I don't know who their gods are in that case. I mean, shopping, I guess. There are those who say, my friend Leon Wieseltier in Washington, who's a scholar of Judaism and former literary editor of the New Republic, Leon has quipped, the enemy of religion these days is not non-religion, it's shopping. So some of it may be the gods. I'm sorry not to leave you on a bright note, but not all of them, not all of them.